is one of the world's most celebrated economists, and when former RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan says that societies have been left behind by markets and state, it is perhaps reason to sit up and take notice. He also talks about in his latest offering, the third pillar, about the rise of populist nationalism, a theme that is very, very important in India, and it is indeed a pleasure to have him right here on ET Now. So thank you very much for being with us. I hope the jet lag is over. I'm tempted to start with the book, but I will instead start with news. The Congress says it consulted many economists on the minimum income guarantee scheme. In fact, Rahul Gandhi has named you and said you were consulted as well. Were you?
I talked to Congress people, of course, and I talked to people from other parties. Now, I have talked about the scheme, yes.
So when you say you've talked about the scheme, there are many in the BJP who are raising heckles to this and saying that how are you having political dialogues, and is this a political conversation that you're having?
When people ask me how do we, how does give us some ideas on some of these issues, I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants ideas on economic issues.
And it's so
and this scheme is, has economic foundations. After all, it's a direct benefit transfer, which is part of the JAM trilogy which the government has been pushing. So in that sense, I don't see why it's particularly political.
But Dr. Rajan, do you endorse the minimum income guarantee scheme? Because one of the things that it has done, at least in the last 2 or 3 days since it was announced, is it has got the narrative back to the basics as far as elections is concerned. But do you particularly endorse this, and do you believe this narrative is going to be here to stay because this concerns the common man?
Look, I mean, there's a common theme in the last 2 governments, which has been that we need to figure out a way to make direct benefit transfers so that people have the money, they are more empowered, and they can pick and choose how they spend it, right? So trust the people has been a common theme. And to my mind, this is an extension of that idea. How do we get more power to the people as direct poverty alleviation? Now, what has to be sort of figured out, which is why I understand there's a committee that is going to be set up and so on, is the details, how this works, how it fits with the fiscal space, issues like that. But the important thing is that it is a poverty alleviation scheme, and I think both the major coalitions have signed on to the idea that moving towards more direct benefits is the way.
Do you believe it's become political because there was something called Kisan Samman that was talking about 6,000 rupees a year, this is talking about 72,000, that pales in comparison to this. Do you believe that is where the politics comes in?
You're better at deciphering the politics than I am. I mean, the real issue is there are 2 sources of distress in the economy today. One is agricultural distress, and the other is, the poverty that we've always had. And the question is, how do we alleviate both? And I would think that the way we want to do it is sort of do this as a way of bringing people back into the mainstream, not as a permanent process.
So I'm going to ask you a few more questions on this and then move forward. It is obviously the biggest social protection scheme that has been attempted anywhere in the world, 6,000 rupees a month to the bottom 20%. You said things still have to be worked out, and obviously there's a committee that's going to look into this. But as far as the fiscal viability of this is concerned, is it a given it can't be done without higher taxes? And so should one brace up for taxes on inheritance, on wealth, business turnover? Is higher taxes a given?
Look, I think the amount of space this will consume, or any scheme, depends on what all is being run at the same time.
True.
I mean, as you said, we have now a scheme of direct transfers to agriculture. We have this scheme. How much do they overlap? How much can you reduce the extent of overlap so the same person is not getting from multiple sources?
True.
And of course, we have myriad other schemes. And the question is, can we look at all of them and see what is effective, what is not? Ultimately, you will have to create fiscal space for this, whether it is through higher taxes or cutting spending on less effective schemes is something that will have to be opined on by the next government.
So as an economist, and I know you said this to me in Davos, the temptation in India is to keep piling up scheme one after the other, and it's obviously political suicide to wane any of those off. Do you believe the success of this will lie in getting through that distortion, waning away what exists and then getting this on?
I think that's the idea? A planning phase. Look, I'm not familiar with the details of what is planned, but a planning phase in which you figure out what you give at the same time you have a sense of what is superfluous, is necessary, right? That you're trying to effectively create room for what is more effective. And that, to my mind, is very important. That and that's why I think the rollout process that I've read about sort of makes sense. That you want to do it in a deliberate way.
And it should be done in a phased manner so that you know what the challenges are and can
What
be
the challenge, and I think you correctly pointed out. Once you give something,
it's difficult.
It's very hard to take it away. So at the same time as you're giving, you want to make sure that whatever superfluous is also taken off.
You know, when Manrega was launched and there were skeptics around it, but truth be told, it did democratize the right to work. It gave people, at least in the rural areas, a minimum wage. It set a certain benchmark beyond which payments had to be made. Is this scheme, in that sense, as big an idea that will capture the political mind space? So that is one question. And B, is it an obvious extension of Manrega in many ways?
Well, I think again, I mean, a lot has to be seen as it plays out. I think the idea that you want to target the very poor and give them the ability to build livelihoods makes sense. But at the same time, whatever you create, you don't want that to hold people back from looking for jobs, from going out into work.
Sure.
I think looking at the work of Abhijit Banerjee, who's been one of the big players in this, there certainly are levels of support at which it doesn't prevent people from going out to look for work, but helps them create some of the human capital that is necessary for them to be sort of contributing citizens in the economy. So what that level is, how we get there, all those things I think are
will be work in progress.
Will be thought through.
But Dr. Rajan, is there a tacit admission by the political class, if I may? And I'm not just talking about this in particular, and Kisan on the other hand. Is there a tacit admission that growth in itself is not going to be that rising tide which will lift boats, that will alleviate poverty? It is not as if productivity will go up, and because of growth and things will be taken care of. We will perhaps need to put cash in pockets of people for poverty to be eradicated. Is there a tacit admission on that count?
First, I think every industrial country has set a minimum safety net. And as we grow wealthier, we have to think about what that is. But second, I think these are two hands, and you need both to clap. On the one hand, you need to create the jobs so that people can actually go out into the workforce. On the other hand, you also need people to have a basic level of capacity. If you have kids who don't have adequate nutrition and therefore cannot function, if they haven't been adequately schooled, what kind of labor are they going to do? So basically, to create the capacity, that is one set of transfers, but you don't want a permanently dependent set of the population. You want them to be able to go to the workforce, for which you need to create jobs. So I would say, ultimately, a job is the best form of inclusion, but jobs require capacity also. And we need both.
But how tough is it going to be to create those jobs? I remember you once said when you were at the RBI that the only kind of jobs that will survive are the ones that need human empathy, because and your book talks a lot about it, how technology is disrupting jobs. So I have a question there. What kind of jobs do you think can be created? Because there's one thing called jobs and there's one thing called gainful employment. And the second thing is there, again, I'm going to go back to the question, is there a tacit admission again at the end of the political class, on the part of political class, to accept that perhaps those kind of jobs will not be created? The BJP promised the moon on jobs, couldn't deliver, and the Congress doesn't want to touch on jobs and is instead talking about minimum income.
Look, I think it is impossible for the government to create all gainful employment in the country. We have to enlist the private sector, we have to enlist the public sector into creating those jobs, right? That it cannot be government jobs. And so how do you do that? And I think we need to have a strategy for enhancing the growth of gainful employment. I would say there are some clear possibilities. For example, infrastructure. If we can unleash infrastructure in a big way, the construction itself will create jobs, but also outside of construction, you will get a whole lot of new jobs being created in manufacturing as our logistics improve. You will get service jobs around those. I mean, follow any highway, you see so many jobs being created around it. So, to my mind, that would be something that any government that comes in will have to focus on. How do we enhance the pace of infrastructure creation? Tourism, another place where you can create a lot of service-intensive jobs, which can absorb very many people, whether it's hotels, restaurants, and activities around that. So I think what we need to do is identify 4 or 5 areas where you can create many more jobs. But for that, we also will need policy reform. For example, infrastructure. Land acquisition is
I'll come to that, and I think that's an important point that I have, because if you were FM is the thing that you've quoted, land acquisition. I'll come to that in just a bit, but let me quickly get minimum income guarantee out of the way. The debate on this particular scheme seems to be divided between the bleeding hearts and a very elite way of looking at poverty. And you know, those people turn around and say you're going to make the poor people lazy. Truth be told, the poor don't have resources. But poverty is a dynamic situation. You know, you are poor depending on the situation in your life, the circumstances. Do you believe a scheme like this, at least theoretically speaking, doesn't have to be in perpetuity? You know, people will have resources to take care of their skills. They could look at more gainful employment. And just theoretically speaking, from an economist's point of view, does a scheme like this need to be in perpetuity?
It doesn't. I mean, what you're talking about is some kind of a push.
That's right,
to
yeah.
people to get them going. Your hope is that it's not so much the scheme will get removed, but any kind of poverty alleviation scheme will have fewer and fewer beneficiaries as the beneficiaries so-called graduate from the scheme. So the idea would be that, following your line of thought, that if you give them enough of a push, that many of them will not need it on a permanent basis. But those are the things that need to be thought through. How do you sort of promote graduation? How do you get people out? The objective is not to have people permanently in, but to help them get out of that state.
You know, one of the things that's being said, and I strongly disagree with it, but it's only fair that I bring out that argument in this interview, is that a scheme like this disincentivizes people from working. It incentivizes people to be jobless. How untrue is that argument, and how elitist is that to look at poverty?
Well, there is a level of income support at which it is comfortable not to work. And the sort of economic question is this that level of income support? And my guess is most people would feel, we can have a debate about it, but this level of income support is certainly not at the level at which you can live comfortably in a big city. Now, obviously, you have to see what levels are in poorer areas, what the necessary level of income there is. Those are the kinds of issues that will have to be debated and thought through if the scheme is to work well. I mean, the broader point, I think, is going back to we have already the scheme in many ways, right? That we have so many things trying to tackle poverty, many of them very poorly targeted, so they're not reaching the ultimate.
Do you believe in its import, the target group is better here?
Well, if you can do it right, you can target much better. And to your earlier point that study, will people sort of get lazy and not work? Studies show that these kinds of targeted schemes don't necessarily have that effect because they targeted at the very poor, and the level of income support is not so grand that, there is a level at which I would retire, right?
But that's not 72,000 rupees a year.
Exactly.
And I also think, truth be told, I also think that's a very elitist and, if I may say, an insensitive argument to make, that just because there's going to be income support, people will stop working.
But also, I think there is some sense that this is, this is about better targeting and empowering people, right? And that's something that both parties seem to be agreed on. And I think that what you have to think about is also what kinds of sort of mistargeted schemes it replaces.
Fair point. A quick last question. For Nyay to really work as a poverty eradication scheme, one believes that the government has to certainly universalize two things, and that's education and health. Do you believe that's possible, and do you believe we have the resources for it?
Well, again, it depends on the level of support. I mean, if you have universal health care with no questions asked about any kind of treatment, even the US cannot afford it. It's just, it doesn't have that level of capacity. On the other hand, if you have, fairly carefully structured processes by which people can get medical assistance, and that there are limits to people overusing it, I think those could work quite effectively, and that you have constraints on overbilling and so on, though that kind of medical support could work. Similarly on education, right? We have effectively public education today, right up to, certainly primary and secondary. The question is, how effective is it? What's the quality? And can we improve quality? That, to my mind,
survey after survey seems to show that the quality is extremely poor. You are in India at a time when India is going to vote in the next 2 weeks, at least the first phase. What do you believe India is going to vote for and should vote for in 2019?
Well,
is this election going to be about national security versus economic realities?
Well, let me get back to the book.
Yes, I will. I'm going to talk about populist nationalism.
I mean, look, I do think I'm talking about broader challenges India has today. I mean, India's problem is getting to middle income. We're not quite there. Reaching $2,000 per capita income, little more than that. But middle income is more like $5,000, $6,000. How do we get there? And for that, we need all these reforms which will increase our pace of growth, create the jobs, reduce social tension, all those things. So it seems to me that we are at a point where really, if we can enhance the pace of growth significantly with a fresh set of reforms, a second generation of reforms, we could reduce some of these tensions which are affecting our society.
Alluding to tensions, your book particularly talks about populist nationalism that's on rise in the West. We're seeing, signs of that in India as well. How do you believe it's playing out in India differently from how it's playing out in the US? Because people under attack here are not essentially the elite rich. That's not under attack. How do you believe populist nationalism is playing out here?
Well, so again, in populism certainly has some disdain for the views of the elite, not necessarily the rich, but by elite, the professional class, the technocrats, the experts. And certainly says they keep talking, but that's not important. What is important is the people. Now, it can go in two directions. The populism of the left, which says what we need to do is tax the very rich and redistribute. And there's always some inkling of that, and there's some undertone of that in every country, including India. And there's populism of the right, which is, the people who are to blame for this certainly are the elite in favoring specific communities, but often that they tend to overemphasize the rights of minorities, the rights of immigrants, and so on, and they basically are creating vote banks, and they are to blame for your problem. Those who are in the majority community. That's the majoritarian populist nationalism. And I think we have undercurrents of both in every industrial country, but also in India today. Now, what is different in India is that, I mean, to some extent, it's not so much the fact that people were doing well and are doing poorly today. I mean, there's some of that when you look at the charts and so on. But it's also that the ladder of progress seems to be, less available. And there we go back to the issue of jobs. When you have all these youngsters...
You feel opportunities are being taken away.
Or they don't exist, and you start asking, what is happening? Why am I not getting a decent job? After all, I have an undergraduate degree.
True.
Why am I forced to apply for these low-level government jobs, and along with so many others?
But then, taking that argument forward, is populist nationalism then a phenomena in transition, or is it actually more entrenched and is here to stay?
No, I think it's a phenomenon that gains strength in times when either economic growth is not really strong, or particular segments, regions are particularly affected. This is the problem in the West, that particular areas, especially manufacturing intensive areas, have been hit very hard. And this is where President Trump, for example, gets his core constituency.
True.
People who've lost their jobs, who were riding in the middle class and have fallen significantly. And so is this permanent? Well, economic growth will help. But also, if you can directly target the problems in specific communities, and that's the theme of the book, how do we decentralize power to the communities so they can target their problems more effectively? In the US, there is this move towards what is called place-based growth schemes. That is, instead of trying to solve problems at the center, where you don't know the specifics of a particular community. In my book, I talk about a community which has a lot of crime. How does the center know how to solve the crime issues in the local community? The community knew that we had to close down the local pubs because they were where all the criminals congregated, and they had community action to resolve the crime issue. Can we empower people more, decentralize more, in order that people actually take action?
Is that what you call civic nationalism?
Civic nationalism is more at the national level, which would be the sense that we all belong to a country regardless of what our color, ethnicity, or religion is. And that so long as we swear allegiance to the ideals of the country, we are all part of the country. And I think that's true of India, that's true of the United States. In India, if you believe in the ideals of the Constitution, you are an Indian. I mean, you get Indian citizenship, of course, but we've had all kinds of people acquire Indian citizenship.
Sure.
And you don't determine citizenship on whether you are thus and such religion or you're thus and such ethnicity.
True.
That, to my mind, is a very syncretic view of nationality, which allows for all possibilities. But then people say, if in that, your identity is sort of diffused, where do you get to express your identity? And my argument in the book is it should be expressed at the local level. That, if you feel that you're not a cosmopolitan, well, by all means, live in a community which other people like you.
But your book, yes, talks about that your identity should be, made more public at a local level. But are we seeing the opposite of that happen, and which is why the social strife? We are seeing identities being thrust upon, identities being made very vocal at a national level.
Yes, and that is the danger. That is the danger I point to, because the community itself is breaking down. You cannot feel confident about expressing your identity locally. In fact, you're ashamed of your local community because it's in deep distress.
True.
And this is the problem I'm talking about in the West. And as a result, you look for identity elsewhere. And then along comes this very magnetic politician who says, you are part of this larger sort of group, the white majority which inherits the ethos of our country, and therefore that is the broader community you belong to, and that's very reassuring. I belong somewhere. I mean, people like Hannah Arendt have talked about this problem.
True.
That when you don't have local identity, you then become very susceptible to these promises of a bigger identity. The problem is not so much the nationalism as the fact that you look for enemies to reinforce your sense of identity. What unites whites other than the color of the skin? It is the other. It is the darker people.
Are we seeing a lot of that in India? You're looking upon a certain community to unite against them.
that is the worry that we have to, that is the concern we have to fight against, that we should not be pointing to our fellow Indians and saying that's the problem or this one is the problem. That, to my mind, the breakdown of national unity will create many more problems for us than we have today.
Fair point.
And so I would say that therefore a more syncretic view of us all belonging, the civic nationalism I talked about, which is embedded through our founding fathers, through Gandhi and Nehru, through the Constitution, through Ambedkar. This all makes sense as a coming together.
Dr. Rajan, you referred to second generation reforms, and I want to go back to that. And I have two questions. Let me begin with the first question. Are you advocating second generation reforms with far more gusto because the first generation have outlived their relevance and impact?
Not their relevance. They're still very relevant. They're still very important. But we are backtracking on a little bit. And we are reaching the limits of that first generation, right?
Okay.
The first generation was let's reduce tariffs, let's have more freer trade, let's de-license, etc., etc. Now we're reaching the limits of that, and we are coming up against new constraints, right? For example, one is this block on infrastructure creation. We have the pace. I mean, yeah, we're doing reasonably well on roads, but we should be doing much more and much faster on many areas. And of course, our financial system needs a faster cleanup and needs to finance growth more effectively. So, I mean, the question is, are we now ready for the next generation? We've had maybe 7-8 years of very low investment. Why is investment so low? What is the private sector looking for? And can we charge up the animal spirits again so that we get strong investment and, of course, the jobs associated with that investment?
And I think you continue to make a very important point that private sector in India is too dependent on the government, and that needs to change as well. But which are the 2 or 3, besides infrastructure and finance that you speak about, the second generation reforms that you will endorse that you believe can kickstart the economic growth that we need for a country like India?
Well, obviously we have to look at what is standing in the way of investment. And it may be that once you kickstart infrastructure investment, demand starts picking up more widely, and the animal spirits that are there kick in. I mean, one of the worries has to be that after 5, 6, 7 years of about 7% growth, we still don't see capacity utilization at a point where the private sector wants to invest in a big way. So what is holding back investment? Why is it that we don't have the sense of confidence that is needed? I think those are things we need to figure out and try and figure out what would the key touch points. Now, it is quite possible that once you announce a new sort of opening up, a new willingness to liberalize, that the animal spirits pick up and you get strong growth. But I would say, look at things like foreign direct investment, look at domestic investment, look at sectors. How can tourism play an important part? And try and think about how you would enhance sort of growth in these areas.
So talking about growth, I think there's a bit of a schizophrenia as far as growth is concerned in India. We keep saying we're the fastest growing economy in the world, and yet we seem to doubt whether we are expanding or receding as an economy. You have added to this debate because you've said that how can we grow at 7% and not have jobs? Do you doubt the 7% growth, or do you believe it is disturbing because it's jobless?
No, look, the reality is I don't know what the true numbers are either on jobs or on GDP growth. I mean, I do think the change to the new methodology in GDP numbers was an attempt to come to the frontiers in terms of methodology. However, the output of these numbers and the dissonance with the employment numbers, of which we have various sources, all suggest that, look, and with investment, why with all this growth is investment not picking up? Why is capacity utilization still relatively low? Something is not adding up. And so the question is, which one is the problem? And I think that, to understand that, we need a relook at our statistics and understand, a fresh outside look to see, what may be going wrong.
Before I question the statistical apparatus a little more, the data debate in India, whether it's jobs data, whether it's crime data, whether it's growth data, whether it is data of farmer suicide, it all seems to be reduced to mudslinging, a lot of name calling, and it seems to be very deep-rooted in political biases. Especially 108 very eminent economists in some sort of a shouting match with some CAs who've written on Indian economy and GDP series and all of that. Do you believe this is nothing but politically motivated debate?
I don't think it's necessarily politically motivated. I do think that people come with their biases to the debate, and they may not sort of intend to be political, but it emerges as political. What I would like to see, which is why, I mean, earlier there was no back and forth about the GDP numbers. We took what the CSO gave us and said this is what it is. My worry is that with so much noise about these numbers, so much noise about the labor numbers, that in fact policy making itself may not be appropriately attuned. If we felt, for example, that we were growing less than what the numbers suggested, that the true growth was lower, you would have policy sort of impulses. You would have pressure to undertake policy to enhance growth. On the other hand, if you don't have that sense, then you may be coasting along. And it turns out when you look back over history that perhaps that was the wrong policy, whether it's monetary, fiscal, or even structural reform.
I'm asking a very blunt question because you have the advantage of being a global insider of sorts. Does the world believe we are manipulating our data?
I see too much, not so much manipulating, but there's a cynicism now about our data which has come in. Partly driven by the kinds of resignations we've seen from various bodies and the idea that certain surveys are not being released. So India was never questioned
for the credibility
earlier,
of its data.
And now we are being sort of grouped with, at least by some investors, with some of the countries whose data has historically been suspect. China, for example, one of my colleagues has written a piece which suggests they've overstated growth by 2 percentage
That's
points.
Right, yes.
So I don't think we want to get there. I think we've had some historical trust in our numbers, which is why I'm saying let's restore that trust.
So how does the data credibility get restored? It can't be restored by the people in the know.
I think what you need is a group of outsiders, and outsiders doesn't mean people outside the country, but that a couple of them would help, along with trusted people within the country, people who have an impeccable reputation and who are not affiliated with any particular side, who are academic in nature. Get them to examine the whole thing and see where the sources of discrepancy is. They can talk to all sides on this and try and figure out what really is the problem. By the way, all said and done, GDP numbers are like sausage making. You don't want to know what goes into them because there are lots of assumptions. The problem is if the assumptions are biased, you can pretty much sort of move it some distance. So what we need is a evaluation of the whole set of assumptions and the process by which they arrived at.
Your book talks about jobs and the trouble of creating jobs because of technology, and we've spoken about that. But as a nation, we take a lot of pride in the fact that we'll be the youngest nation in the world by 2030. But are we socially and economically ready to be the youngest nation in the world without employment opportunities being created? Because if you look at history of the world, every time there is unemployment, it leads to a social strife.
Yeah. No, I fully see that as a concern, which is why, to prevent the population dividend from turning into a population curse, we absolutely need to focus on jobs. And I think without question, whatever the jobs, actual jobs numbers are, the anecdotal evidence of so many people trying for government jobs suggests two things. One, the private sector is not providing jobs to the extent that can compete with government jobs.
Or security of jobs, maybe.
Security of jobs, etc., etc. But again, there's no reason why it could not. If in fact we have strong growth, we should be able to create those jobs. In some sense, that also the capacity of the workforce may also be limited in the sense that private sector, you would think it could create a whole new set of job activities.
Sure.
If in fact there were a lot of really well qualified people coming in. And that is also something to focus on. It's not just whether there are jobs, but whether there are people skilled enough for those jobs, which is the second part of this.
So it's more of a chicken and an egg situation. As far
I mean,
as
you have to work on both. You have to work on both.
There is another thing that I want to speak to you about, and
which is why education is part of the new set of reforms.
Yes. As a former central banker, I can't not ask you what's happening in India, and we just saw a very big bailout of Jet Airways. I am no fan of Vijay Mallya. I think he stood for everything that was wrong with people who thought debt was equity. No fan there, but Vijay Mallya says that the treatment meted out to Jet was very different from the treatment that was meted out to Kingfisher Airline. The government was very actively involved in bailing Jet out. Is there merit in some of that argument that Kingfisher was allowed to fail and Jet was not? And are you personally a little surprised with how the banks treated Jet with kid gloves in terms of buying further stake, in terms of bailing out Etihad by reducing stake? Does it bother you?
Well, let me put it this way, that first I wasn't there at the Kingfisher
Sure,
or the
yes.
Jet, so I don't know the details. But it is not necessary that every company go through bankruptcy court. If you did that, the bankruptcy court would be swamped with the number of bankruptcies that have to go through it. Ideally, what you want is the bankruptcy court to act as a shadow.
And as the last resort.
As the
perhaps.
last resort. If we don't reach agreement between borrowers and the lenders, then we will go there. And that gives the lenders a lot of bargaining power. So my sense is if you can operate an out-of-court restructuring, which achieves much of what the bankruptcy court would, but which is transparent, which looks fair, that is not entirely a bad thing. In fact, it takes pressure off the bankruptcy court. But what is important here is the earlier point you made, that equity should be equity and
True.
debt. So you cannot, in a sense, bail out the existing equity on the backs of the existing lenders. That, in fact, if you go in that direction,
True.
equity should take a really big hit.
But that's exactly why I asked this question. You're right that IBC has to be the last resort. It has to be a shadow where we cannot reach consensus. We didn't see this active participation by either banks or promoters when steel, power, cement was going to IBC. And one raises the question, why is it kosher to do so now when it wasn't then?
Well, I mean, circumstances have also changed. Now, again, I'm not defending any particular, I want to talk about the principle that earlier what happened was there was no IBC. And so a lot of these projects were in distress for a long time. And the promoter was not making concessions, etc. So when the IBC came, that became the avenue through which you force the concessions, right? And some promoters have lost their business.
True.
But, maybe deservedly so because they weren't running them very well. I think in this case, there is an IBC and there is a shadow of the IBC. And you can threaten to take it into the IBC if necessary in order to do the appropriate restructuring. So in that sense, we are in a different environment from that one. Again, without knowing the details, I'm not defending any particular structure, but I'm saying it is possible to restructure out. What is important in looking at this is to see if it's fair. Fair in the sense of the equity holders lose a fair amount.
True.
And the debt holders don't make concessions until the equity holders take a really big hit.
I'm not so sure if that has really happened in this case, but we'll leave it at that. As somebody who waged the war in many ways against crony capitalists by the whole NPA norms, how do you see the developments from afar? Nirav Modi is right now in jail. Vijay Mallya extradition is on. He's appealed. Is this, I don't know if the right word is satisfying, but is this in some way, do you look at this and say, mission being accomplished, or is this too much optics right now?
No, look, I don't want to use the word satisfied either. I think the objective, right from the beginning, was to make debt look more like debt, so that creditors would be more willing to lend. The ultimate objective is growth. If creditors have no sort of confidence that they will get their money back, they will be repaid, and that their debt becomes equity to support the promoter, then essentially lenders will always continue taking the hit, will be unwilling to lend, but also ultimately most of the losses come back to the taxpayer because after all these are public sector banks often that are lending. That is a very inequitable system and eventually creates a revulsion that we saw in the last few years, some of that. So changing that environment was very important. We've seen the first steps. I would say we are far from finishing that process.
True.
You have to make sure the IBC continues to perform and shortens the time that people are in bankruptcy court. We have to remove this endless sequence of appeal, counter appeal, which
it seems to be stuck in some legalese right now.
Yes, and at some point, the judicial system has to say, this is just playing a game. We are going to not entertain appeals. These are frivolous beyond a certain point. Some precedents which they are setting up right now will help. You say, okay, they ruled in this way, there's no chance for appeal. And the appellate tribunal should start refusing to take up appeals just on the grounds that this doesn't even meet the basic grounds.
And only then will we see perhaps faster resolution
And the whole objective is faster resolution, because after all, we had systems that took 10, 15 years to resolve, in which case the borrower had no fear.
Dr. Rajan, you are not, quote unquote, just a Luddite economist. You're also somebody who keeps a very close eye on what happens around the world globally. And as I close this, I have two questions to ask of you there. Post the Pulwama attack and then what happened in Balakot, India's political and social discourse is largely dominated by a very hyper-nationalist discourse of sorts. Do you endorse something like this, or do you fear that this can very quickly relegate into communal strife, a society divided around communal lines?
Well,
we saw some of that happen.
This is an area where I have no expertise, so I will not
But
venture into this area. Well, look, I mean, the book is about populist, about the fears of populist nationalism when many countries are sort of driven by it. And I think what we need globally is more of a sense of the benefits of working together. I think today we are seeing barriers emerge between countries. The trade barriers, for example, that the US is raising, and the kind of discourse then that emerges makes it more difficult to get global solutions. So if China is fighting with the US and they're erecting trade barriers, how much dialogue is there going to be on global emissions to reduce the possibility of climate change? It's much harder in that kind of environment. So I would say we need to figure out how we dial down the kind of temperature globally, that includes cross-border terrorism, that includes things that are a source of conflict, and that requires global cooperation, because I mean terrorism is, for example, a kind of activity that can be addressed through cooperation between countries.
Yes, it can be, but I think there is a distinct difference between how we are trying to address it with Pakistan and with China. And because you understand trade, our relationship with Pakistan has been very blow hot, blow cold. We want to entertain them at some point in time, then we want to wage a war, all of that. With China, and especially after the UNSC, there is a very distinct view that we must hurt China. But given the size of our economy, given the size of our trade, is that the path to go down? Can we hurt China where it really matters, which is economy, which is trade?
Again, I think that as a country, our focus going forward should perhaps be taking a little bit of a leaf from the Chinese, which is while preserving our respect and resisting any intrusion on our sovereignty, I think we also need to build ourselves to be a strong, economically powerful country. And as you get economically powerful, you have the ability to spend resources on strengthening your armed forces. You have the ability to become really powerful on all other dimensions, including on your R&D, your artificial intelligence, which now is a big source of where defense spending goes.
True.
So my sense is that focusing on strengthening our economy is almost surely the best form of national defense we have, while taking care of the more immediate issues that we have. So I would say that, coming back to, maybe this sounds like a tape recorder, we need that second generation of reforms, because only through growth will we be taken seriously by other nations, but also will we have the strength
to stand up
in a firm way.
So I can't obviously not ask you this question as we end this interview. In an interview to Times Now, to a colleague of mine a few days back, in response to a statement that you had made on Urjit Patel's exit, Piyush Goyal said that you nurture political ambitions and you should join politics. Two questions there. Do you, and will you?
Well, I think you've seen throughout that I'm very conscious of what I can do and what I can't do, what I know and what I don't know. I don't know anything about politics. I'm a technocrat. I think my capabilities lie there, and so I have absolutely no interest in entering politics.
But there are technocrats who've led this nation, Dr. Manmohan Singh being a very prominent one, and because there is speculation that and there is a wide consensus of sorts that in a non-BJP government you could be a consensus choice for a finance minister. Will you be open to a role like that?
Look, that is entirely speculative, and the whole sort of I don't even want to venture there. I think the main issue is, again and again, I want to say, we do need that second generation of reforms, and I'm happy to advise.
Why wouldn't you want to?
I'm happy to advise anybody who's pushing it forward. I'm happy to advise anybody.
That's a diplomatic answer, but I'll settle for that. Thanks very much, Dr. Rajan, for being with us.